July 11, 1881. The Southern Ocean. 300 miles off the Cape of Good Hope. The night was clear. The stars were out. There was no fog, no storm, no reason whatsoever for confusion. The HMS Picante, a fully crewed British Royal Navy Corvette, was cutting through the dark water at a steady pace when the officer on watch stopped mid-sentence and pointed. Off the port bow. Glowing. Not the dim flicker of lantern light from a distant vessel. Not a phosphorescent wave breaking against distant rock. Something luminous, a ship, in full sail, burning with a reddish inner light, as though the hull itself had caught fire from the inside out. The sails were full and taut. The rigging was intact and detailed. The silhouette was unmistakable, an old vessel, Dutch in design, cutting across the black water at a speed no wind that night could have produced. 13 crew members saw it. The officer of the watch saw it. And then a midshipman on duty stepped forward, pressed his spyglass to his eye, and stared for a long moment before lowering it in silence. He recorded the sighting in the ship's official log in his own handwriting. His name was Prince George of Wales. The future King George V of England. The entry reads plainly, almost clinically, a strange red light, as of a phantom ship all aglow. No dramatization. No embellishment. Just a future monarch, in an official document, recording something he could not explain. By morning, the lookout who had first spotted the vessel fell from the rigging and died. The officer who had confirmed the sighting was struck by a sudden, severe illness from which he never fully recovered. 2 other men involved in documenting the event suffered separate accidents in the weeks that followed. The Picante herself returned to port damaged, her voyage shortened by misfortunes that accumulated so rapidly her commander later described the journey as cursed. No other vessel was ever found in those waters. No explanation for the light was produced. The naval inquiry, if one was ever formally held, left no surviving record. What 13 witnesses, including a future king, had seen, committed to an official naval document, and suffered for seeing, should not have existed. And yet the record insists it did. And if history is read honestly, this was not even close to the first time. The Cape of Good Hope has always been a place where the ocean becomes something else entirely. Where the Atlantic crashes into the Indian Ocean with the fury of 2 worlds refusing to share the same space. Sailors have called it the Cape of Storms since the 15th century, and they meant it in the most literal possible sense. The wind screams at 50 knots, waves mount to 40 feet, and ships have been swallowed whole in weather that appeared in under an hour. But the Cape has always carried a second kind of danger. One that does not appear on any weather chart, in any tide table, in any navigational manual ever published. In 1835, a British merchant captain named Robert Walsingham was approaching the Cape from the northwest when his lookout reported a vessel sailing directly into the Gale building from the southwest. No distress flags. No heaving to. No alteration of sail. The ship was driving straight into the teeth of a storm that Walsingham himself was preparing to wait out. He changed course to intercept. If a ship was in trouble, maritime law required assistance. By the time he reached the coordinates, there was nothing. No wreck. No debris. No oil on the water. No sound of men in distress. But what stopped Walsingham cold, what he wrote about in his log with a specificity that rings distinctly like truth, was the detail his first mate reported while watching through the spyglass. The ghost vessel had passed through a wave. Not crested it. Not broken through it. Passed through it, the way light passes through glass. The wave had continued unbroken on the other side, as though nothing had intersected it at all. That is not the embellishment of a frightened sailor inventing a story. That is the observation of a professional mariner who understood perfectly well how water and would interact, recording something that violated everything he knew. Move forward to 1860. A Dutch merchant vessel, again near the Cape, again in conditions that were clear enough for sustained observation, tracked a luminous ship for 45 minutes. 45 minutes is a very long time. Long enough to eliminate confusion. Long enough to have multiple officers confirm the observation from different positions on the vessel. long enough that the crew had time to discuss among themselves what they were seeing, to argue about it, to attempt alternative explanations, and to fail to produce one. 3 men from that crew refused to continue the voyage when they reached port. Their captain pressed on. He arrived at his destination to discover his financial partner had died on the exact night of the sighting, taking with him the entirety of their shared capital. The cargo had spoiled. The voyage that was supposed to make his fortune unmade it entirely instead. One encounter might be weather and an overworked imagination. 2 might be coincidence, however strained. But the maritime archive of sightings near the Cape of Good Hope stretches across 400 years, drawn from dozens of independent sources in multiple languages, logged by officers of the Royal Navy, Dutch merchant captains, Portuguese navigators, and at least one future king. The description across those 4 centuries barely varies: a high Dutch hull, antique rigging, impossible speed, and a cold luminescence that does not behave like any natural light source known to science. This is not oral folklore passed from grandmother to child. These are professional records. Logged, archived, preserved. And they converge on something that was there. To understand what created the Flying Dutchman, you have to understand the world that product. Edit. Not the legend, the reality underneath it. The 17th century Dutch East India Company, the VOC, was the most powerful commercial organization the world had ever constructed. At its absolute peak, it was larger, wealthier, and more militarily capable than most European nations. It commanded the spice routes of the East Indies, the silk routes of Asia, the gold routes of Africa. Its ships, hundreds of them, moved between Amsterdam and Batavia on a schedule that was maintained with a ferocity that would strike modern observers as almost incomprehensible. The Cape of Good Hope was not a destination for VOC captains. It was a bottleneck. A violent, unpredictable obstacle that sat between the Atlantic and Indian Oceans and demanded to be rounded no matter the season, no matter the weather, no matter the cost. Every day of delay at the Cape was a day's worth of perishable cargo deteriorating in the hold. Every unscheduled stop was money evaporating. The institutional pressure on VOC captains to push through, to refuse delay, to subordinate fear of weather to fear of their employers, that pressure was total and unrelenting. It produced a particular kind of captain. Men who had learned, over careers of dangerous voyaging, that the sea could be dominated. That hesitation was failure. That caution was for men who didn't want to advance. Into this specific institutional culture steps the figure the legend calls Van der Decken. His name appears in VOC records from the 1640s, not as a legend, not as a cautionary tale, but as a working captain with a documented record of successful runs, a reputation for severity with his crew, and a known history of refusing conditions that had stopped other men. He was not remarkable in any supernatural sense. He was the purest possible product of his system, a man who had been trained by decades of institutional pressure to believe that stopping was the one thing he must never, under any circumstances, do. And then, in the lat. E1640s, he approached the Cape of Good Hope with a cargo that had to arrive, and found the worst weather the Cape had produced in a generation waiting for him. The accounts of what happened at the Cape that season are fragmentary and contradictory in their details, as historical accounts always become when the truth is too uncomfortable to record cleanly. Some Dutch sources suggest a mutiny aboard the vessel, suppressed violently. Others describe an encounter with a storm so catastrophic that the ship's structural integrity was already compromised before Van der Decken made his fatal choice. What they agree on, across sources that had no contact with each other and no motive to coordinate their versions, is the essential shape of what happened. His officers urged him to turn back. Table Bay was close. The Cape in that season produced storms that could destroy a well-built ship in under 2 hours. Experienced captains with far more time at sea had turned back from lesser weather. Turning back was not cowardice. It was the correct professional decision, the one that any reasonable reading of the conditions demanded. He refused. And reportedly, as the storm hit with its full force and his officers renewed their pleas, he lashed himself to the ship's wheel and screamed into the wind. The accounts differ on what he said. Some versions say he swore he would round the Cape if it took until Judgment Day. Others say he invoked something darker, a willingness to accept whatever consequence the sea demanded, if only he could complete his passage. Sailors on other vessels near the Cape that day reported watching a ship drive directly into the storm, all sails set, under full canvas when every other vessel had been stripped bare. They watched it enter the weather system. No account records watching it emerge. No wreck was found. No survivors reached shore. No debris field washed up on the beaches of the Cape Peninsula that could be attributed to a specific loss. In Amsterdam, the VOC marked the ship as overdue. Then missing. Then, months later, lost at sea, a routine administrative notation that closed the file and opened no investigation. That absence of investigation is itself strange. A VOC ship carrying a full cargo, with a documented captain and crew, vanished without survivors in waters that were heavily trafficked. The loss should have generated inquiries, interviews, a formal attempt to establish cause. None of the expected bureaucratic machinery appears to have been engaged. The records simply go quiet, as though someone, somewhere, had decided it was better not to ask too many questions about where that ship had gone. The first reported return came within a decade. A VOC captain named Peter Struys, documented in Dutch naval records, a real and credible figure, reported encountering a vessel near the Cape of Good Hope that he could not identify and could not approach. He attempted to hail it through standard signals. No response came. He altered course to intercept. The vessel drew away from him without any visible adjustment of its rigging or sails, as though the ship itself understood his intention and declined it. And then it was simply gone. What Struys committed to his personal log, the detail that cannot be explained away by suggestion or stress, was the description of the hull. The design was antique. Not unfamiliar in the way that foreign vessels are unfamiliar. Old in a way that stopped him. Older than any design currently in commission by the VOC. Older than anything currently sailing those routes. He wrote that it looked like a ship from his grandfather's era. This technical precision is the element researchers return to repeatedly. A sailor fabricating a ghost story in 1658 does not describe an obsolete hull design. He describes fire and howling and supernatural horror. He reaches for the dramatic. He does not reach for the arcane specificity of naval architecture. Struys described what a professional Reiner would notice first, that the ship he was looking at belonged to a different period of history than the one he was living in. And across the 4 centuries of subsequent sightings, that same technical specificity holds. Different witnesses, different nationalities, different centuries, all describing the same high Dutch hull, the same antique proportion of mast to beam, the same cut of sail that went out of use in the mid-17th century. They are not describing a legend. They are describing a specific ship. The rational explanations deserve to be heard. They always do. The most scientifically grounded is Fata Morgana, an atmospheric optical phenomenon caused by thermal inversion layers above the ocean surface. Under precise conditions, light refracts through stratified air in ways that can make distant objects appear elevated, inverted, or luminous. It is real. It is well documented. It has fooled sailors for centuries and continues to fool them today. It is spectacular enough that, seen without context, it could genuinely be mistaken for something impossible. A second explanation involves the psychology of high-stress environments. Sailors rounding the Cape of Good Hope were operating under conditions of extreme sleep deprivation, physical danger, and cultural saturation with stories of the Dutchman. The human brain, under those conditions, does not simply become confused, it actively constructs the expected perception from ambiguous sensory data. If you know the legend and you are exhausted and frightened, the lights on the horizon will organize themselves, in your mind, into the shape you have been told to fear. Bioluminescence offers a third path, the biological production of cold light by marine organisms, which can create ghostly patches of glow in the water capable, in certain conditions, of suggesting an illuminated form beneath or just above the surface. Sailors unfamiliar with the phenomenon have been bewildered by it. All 3 explanations are scientifically legitimate. All 3 deserve to be taken seriously. And then all three need to be tested against what the documents actually say. Fata Morgana requires specific atmospheric conditions, a warm air layer sitting above cooler surface air, that were not present during the Picante sighting of July 1881. The night was clear and the air temperature uniform across the water. 13 observers at different positions on the ship watched a stable, coherent form for long enough to log it in detail. Fata Morgana does not produce stable, coherent forms. It shimmers, shifts, and dissolves as observers move. It does not hold for 13 witnesses across sustained observation. The physics simply do not accommodate what the log describes. Mass suggestion cannot account for Captain Walsingham in 1835, because Walsingham had not encountered the Flying Dutchman legend before his sighting. He recorded the event in his personal log before speaking to any other captain, and the detail he included, the ship passing through a wave rather than over it, is not the kind of embellishment a suggestible mind produces. Suggestion fills in blanks with what is expected. It does not generate entirely novel impossibilities. Bioluminescence does not produce ships. It does not generate masts, rigging, hull lines, or the specific silhouette of a 17th-century Dutch East Indiaman. It creates formless patches of light. The witnesses who recorded these sightings were professional mariners who could identify a ship's class and approximate age from its profile. They were not looking at a patch of glowing water and imagining the rest. They were describing something with consistent structural detail that matched no vessel of their own era. And then there is the problem that all three explanations share, and that tends to be quietly set aside in academic discussions of the phenomenon, the deaths. The Picante lookout dead the morning after the sighting. The merchant captain in 1860 financially destroyed upon arrival. The accumulated pattern of misfortune that follows documented encounters with a consistency that exceeds any reasonable statistical expectation for coincidence. Optical illusions do not kill. Atmospheric anomalies do not destroy commercial enterprises. Bioluminescence does not bring catastrophe trailing behind it across 400 years of documented history. Something connects the sighting and the suffering. The record demands that acknowledgement, even if it cannot produce the mechanism. Here is what the full body of evidence, read without the comfort of preselected explanations, actually tells us. A real captain, in a real ship, drove himself into an impossible storm at the Cape of Good Hope sometime in the latter half of the 17th century. Neither he nor his ship nor any member of his crew was ever found. Within a decade, mariners began reporting a vessel in those same waters that matched no existing design, older in style, moving in ways that violated the understood physics of sail and wind, occasionally passing through physical matter as though it occupied a different version of the space it appeared to share. The sightings continued without interruption across 4 centuries, documented in independent accounts by witnesses who frequently had no knowledge of each other, in multiple languages, from multiple maritime traditions, logged in official records that still exist. Every major sighting is followed by catastrophe. The catastrophes are not dramatic. They are quiet, specific, and personal, a death here, a financial ruin there, an illness that arrives without explanation and departs without leaving its victim unchanged. They accumulate into a pattern that the rational mind resists precisely because it cannot be accommodated within any framework currently available to us. The Flying Dutchman became a legend because the sightings were real and the suffering was real and the only container large enough to hold. Both was a story. Sailors did not invent the legend and then accidentally produce 4 centuries of corroborating evidence. They produced the evidence first, and the legend was the shape that evidence forced the culture to take. What that evidence points toward remains genuinely, deeply unresolved. Whether it is some permanent anomaly of the physics at the Cape, a location where the confluence of 2 oceans and the specific electromagnetic properties of the seabed creates conditions that have never been fully mapped. Whether it is something stranger, a fold in the way time moves through space, producing an impression of a vessel that is simultaneously present and 4 centuries gone. Whether it is, in some sense that science has not yet built the language to articulate, the actual persisting consequence of a human choice made in a storm, a man who refused so completely to stop that the universe found a way to ensure he never did. None of those are satisfying answers. They are not supposed to be. The last sighting that can be independently verified by multiple witnesses came in 1942, in the middle of a world war, off the harbor at Cape Town. A group of men on shore, civilians, not sailors, with no connection to the legend and no particular superstition to offer, watched a square-rigged sailing ship move into the bay at dusk. They were clear-eyed about it. They assumed it was a historical recreation of some kind, perhaps connected to the war effort's various public events. They waited for it to dock. It never docked. Harbor records from that day, records kept with particular care given the wartime security situation, show no such vessel entering or departing Cape Town. No ship of that description was registered in South African waters. No captain came forward. No crew. No manifest. Nothing. 2 of the men who watched it were involved in separate, unrelated accidents before the following weekend. Neither died. But both men, years later, when they independently encountered the legend of the Flying Dutchman and recognized in it a description of what they had seen, refused to discuss the subject further. One of them, before he closed the door on the conversation, said only this, "I don't think it was meant to be seen." That sentence lingers. Because if the ship is still out there, if whatever Van der Decken became in that storm is still moving through the water near the Cape of Good Hope, still carrying its impossible speed against the wind, still trailing catastrophe behind it across the centuries the way a ship trails its wake, then the question is not whether it exists. For centuries of independent, documented, archived evidence have settled that question beyond the comfort of easy dismissal. The question is what it means for the men who see it. Every account suggests the same answer. They see something they were never supposed to see. Something from a world that ended, persisting in a world that moved on without it. Something that looks like a ship the way a scar looks like a wound, the thing itself long gone, but the mark it left behind refusing to heal. Somewhere tonight, a ship is rounding the Cape of Good Hope. The water is dark. The stars are out. The officer on watch is scanning the horizon with professional attention, looking for rocks, for weather, for lights that might mean another vessel. And somewhere in that darkness, there may be a red glow. Ancient. Patient. Moving against the wind. If he sees it, he will log it. That is what professional mariners do. They record what they cannot explain, because the sea demands honesty about what is out there. And then, in the days that follow, something will go wrong. Something always does.